Welcome back. This is program number 11 in our accelerated NLP training series. Now, by now, you're probably a master of strategy elicitation, certainly of sensory acuity and eye patterns, and rapport, of course. We're going to continue on now with strategies. We've learned how to elicit them and utilize them and test them. But now we need to get into some more of the meat and potatoes of strategies. Like, what makes a strategy well-formed? What makes it so that it really works well? And then, in addition to that, once we're clear about that, what makes it so that we can, or what things we want to look for in the process of installing or changing strategies? And we've had fun with strategies so far. We've learned how to elicit them and utilize them. But I think we need to get into some more nuts and bolts stuff of what makes a strategy well-formed. So let's look at page 56. There are some structural well-formedness conditions for strategy, which means that the strategy is well-formed if it meets these conditions. It first has to have a well-defined representation of the outcome. A lot of times a strategy will run without a well-defined outcome, and you'll get, if you don't have a well-defined outcome, the strategy will produce sort of a nothing result. I think a strategy should use at least 3 of the major representational systems. Here it says all 3, but that means a visual and an auditory and a kinesthetic, if at all possible. There should be at least 3 points in every loop, which, see, sometimes if a strategy loops too tightly, a person can get into a situation where they get caught and they stay in a strategy. I've talked to some folks who perhaps had some points that were a little too tight on their loops. One of my friends named Mark, I've talked about my buddy Mark at many trainings. Mark had a situation where he'd get into an ADK loop and he'd talk to himself and get the feelings and talk to himself and get the feelings and talk to himself and get the feelings, and he'd get stuck in that and he'd go back and forth and back and forth. 3 points in a loop, it will at least allow you to pop out, and probably every loop ought to include an exit point, which Mark didn't have. The strategy should go external after a certain number of steps or a certain amount of time, and it should use the least number of steps to get the outcome. I personally like 3, 4, no more than that in terms of a number of steps. A strategy should have a logical sequence with no steps missing. That is, you should, as you look at it, get a sense that it's logical and you can follow it through and make sense out of how it works. It needs to have internal and external sensory modalities to get the desired outcome, which means that there need to be some external and some internal modalities or representational systems that occur both internally and externally. It should preserve the positive byproducts and eliminate negative consequences. So a person who continually runs a strategy that has negativity will end up being a negative person. So we need to make sure that that we have positive byproducts and positive consequences. The strategy should follow the tote model, and it should minimize bad feelings. I think we talked a little bit about that already. Functional well-formedness conditions include a trigger which starts the process and carries with it the final criteria, an operation to alter the present state to bring it closer to desired state, and a test which compares the present state to the desired state based on pre-sorted criteria, or ad hoc, meaning in the moment. A decision point which determines the next step based on the congruence or lack of congruence of the test completion. If you know the functional well-formedness conditions, you'll be able to ask very specific and well-directed questions if your client has a problem with a strategy. Knowing the functional properties of strategy will allow you to recognize when you receive an answer to a different question than the one asked. Now, I think a lot of times when we get into strategies, people do 2 things. One is they start looking at their own strategies and they go, oh no, my strategies are terrible. So first of all, let me free you up from that one. Your strategies are fine. One of my rules is if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I think that's a pretty important rule. People say to me all the time, well, let's change the strategy. Let's do something about it. Well, here's the first thing. If the strategy meets the well-formedness conditions, but it's not a problem, if it doesn't meet the well-formedness conditions, but it's not a problem for the client, then it ain't broke. If it ain't broke, then you probably ought not to fix it. Now, the question is it causing a problem for the client? That really is an issue. So let's look at page 57. If a strategy is not causing a problem for a client, it probably ought to remain the same as it is, even though you might feel, how could that person possibly use that strategy? You ought to leave the strategy alone unless it's part of the presenting problem. Okay, so the way we install or change strategies includes rehearsing, reframing, metaphor, anchoring, and dissociated state rehearsal. So by rehearsing, what you're going to do is you're going to have the client move their eyes in certain directions while they rehearse the various parts of the strategy. So let's take a very simple strategy and see how we'd rehearse it. Let's take the reassurance strategy that we just got from Lori, and let's say we wanted to install that in somebody. So we would have a visual external with an auditory tonal and a kinesthetic. We can leave out the synesthesia for the moment. So the person would then move their eyes into visual, either visual recall or visual construct, depending on which one was appropriate. And they'd rehearse noticing a certain color and a certain shape, as we elicited from the submodalities. Then they would move their eyes to auditory tonal and say, "Oh boy." And then they would have a feeling, a positive kinesthetic feeling after moving their eyes into kinesthetic. And that would be rehearsing. Reframing, you can actually change a strategy through reframing, but my point of view is that anchoring is the most efficient. You could also use metaphor and tell a story about using different representational systems and tell a story about someone who had a strategy and changed it, and those often work well. But to me, anchoring is probably the most important way to change a strategy. Or installing a strategy. If you're going to install or change a strategy using anchoring, what you simply do is you anchor all the parts of the current strategy. Then you anchor a new part of the strategy, if you're going to install a new part of the strategy, and then you actually install it. Let me give you an example. And this example is actually contained, let me see if I can find where it's contained. This example of strategy installation is actually contained on slide number 66 on page 11 of the strategy section. Slide number 66 of page 11. And so there's a diagram here. And what it says essentially is that I elicited the strategy. Well, first of all, let me tell you what the strategy was for this woman. I had a client who had a VK synesthesia for a buying strategy, for her decision-making strategy. So she'd walk into a store, she'd see something she liked, and she'd buy it. It's kind of a VK. Whoa, I love that. See that, love it, buy it. And she got home, and she ended up having to return about 50% of all the things she bought, which was really messy after a while. And so she came to me and she said, "I'd really like to change this strategy because I'm really, really buying way too much." So we isolated and anchored each part of the strategy. So in this case, she had a visual and a kinesthetic, which we anchored. We anchored the visual first, and we anchored the kinesthetic. And then we installed, in the middle of that, an auditory digital. Now, let me ask you a question. Why would we install an auditory digital in the middle of that rather than after the kinesthetic? Well, the fact is, if we installed an auditory digital after the kinesthetic, she might have already bought, and then she'd try to talk herself into it. So we wanted to put the auditory digital in the middle. So we installed the visual with an anchor, installed the kinesthetic with another anchor, and then putting the auditory digital in the middle, I had her say to herself, "Do I really need this?" And I anchored that in the middle step. Now we've got all three steps anchored, and then we simply chained them together. So I had her move her eyes up into visual and imagine seeing something she liked, or remembering seeing something she liked, and then fired off the auditory digital. She'd say to herself, "Do I really need this?" And then she'd get a feeling of either she wanted it or not, and then she'd either buy it or not. And so I had her then rehearse that several times, firing off the anchors each time. And I had her rehearse it, both buying it and not buying it, so that each time she either bought it or didn't buy it. And then we could see in each case, or she could see in each case, either a positive kinesthetic or a negative kinesthetic, but at least she'd be out and the strategy would be over. And when she came back after a couple of days, she said, my purchasing has dropped off by about 50%. She said, even in the first 2 days, the purchasing has just simply disappeared. I'm now clear about what I want, and I purchase things that I want. And when I always ask myself, do I really need this? And she said, that's just wonderful. So what are the design principles? What design principles are we going to maintain here? Let's look and see on page 57. First of all, you want to maintain the function, which we clearly did with this client. And then you want to intervene before the strategy goes haywire. So her strategy went haywire with the kinesthetic because she'd see something, want it, and buy it immediately. So we simply put the auditory digital in between. Calibrate, of course. You'd reframe or use submodalities for unpleasant feelings or unpleasant voices. You may need to. I worked once with a client who had a really, really incredibly tough attraction strategy. And what would happen is his attraction strategy would be a woman would have to, for him to notice attraction, a woman would have to approach him from a certain angle, coming across the room at a certain angle, and then she'd have to walk around behind him, talk in a certain ear, and come around behind him and talk to him. And before he'd even notice that the person was attracted to him. Well, by deleting the unnecessary steps in between, this guy had a better sense of who was attracted to him and who wasn't. And by the way, it certainly improved his self-esteem dramatically. You also want to make sure that the criteria are accessed sequentially and not simultaneously. So if there's an auditory digital point at that and the client's working with several criteria, you want to have them go through them one at a time. And then you want to make the least amount of change to get the results you want. In a redesign, you probably want to make up what you think would work. I mean, you're the practitioner of NLP. The client's coming to you for assistance. You probably want to think through what you think would work and then ask the client if that would be good to install. Check your own strategy and calibrate the client as you make up or as you suggest a new strategy to them. Calibrate the client and look at them and see if that's something that you think is going to work for them. Let's look at page 58. Now, these are some representational system characteristics which I think is real important in terms of background, in terms of strategy design and strategy installation. So let's chat. I think that each representational system, each one of the visual, auditory, kinesthetic, olfactory, gustatory, and auditory digital, can best represent the aspect of the world that responds to it or corresponds to it directly. Many people get into trouble by representing experience with the wrong representational system. So someone, for example, may represent a feeling visually and not be sufficiently in touch with the feelings. Other people may represent visual with a kinesthetic and be overly in touch with the feelings. So sometimes a person can get trapped by synesthesias, and you can always anchor the synesthesias out. Digital descriptions are always, auditory digital descriptions are always a secondary experience, so generally they'll contain less information than the primary experience which they describe. So if you're looking for, if you want the client to have an experience which is a primary experience, you're probably going to need to go to either visual or auditory or kinesthetic. Remember that auditory digital, and we'll talk about this in the Master Practitioner training, but remember that auditory digital is always a secondary experience, and it has less information than the primary experience which is being described by the auditory digital. Now, auditory digital is valuable. It's valuable as a filing system. It can keep track of experience, it can categorize experience, it can plan and set directions, it can summarize, it can make a running commentary on raw data, it can draw conclusions, it can make sense of things, and that's its job. The job of auditory digital is to make sense of things. Now, auditory tonal can add emphasis and help flesh out raw data, but auditory digital's job is to make sense of things. Visual can represent an enormous amount of data simultaneously and instantaneously, and it can do very rapid comparisons. So VR is very useful for doing very rapid comparisons. Auditory processing is sequential, and if you're going to do auditory processing, it takes longer than visual processing, which tends to be simultaneous. The kinesthetic system has more inertia and more duration than either the visual or the auditory, and actually more inertia and more duration than either of them put together, both of them put together. When making decisions, it's difficult to fully represent possibility using only sounds or words or feelings. The visual system is helpful because it enables one to simultaneously picture different options and make comparisons between them. And that's what we mentioned by VCVR is usually pretty good at that point. Kinesthetic tactile and proprioceptive sensations help provide raw data. Kinesthetic meta is the way that people primarily evaluate their experience. Congruent feelings are perceptual feelings of events involving direct tactile and proprioceptive sensations, and they're purely perceptual or sensory experiences without evaluation. Meta feelings are evaluated feelings about events in response to criteria and usually have a positive or a negative feeling or negative value, and they are what we usually call emotions or feeling states. Meta feelings can be created through past anchoring of experiences and or beliefs. Okay, on to motivation strategies. If you have a client who comes in and wants to work with you on a motivation strategy, now what am I going to do? Well, here's the page 59. This will give you some ideas of if a client comes in and wants to work on motivation strategy. People move either toward or away from. Now remember, we define toward as moving toward what you want, or away from, and that's away from what you don't want. People who move toward too strongly may avoid doing things which are unnecessary. They may never get around to doing unpleasant things. Although they may be necessary to do, but they may avoid doing unpleasant things. People who move away from may never move until things get bad enough. So the key to motivation is to be able to easily and effortlessly do things that are unpleasant. Most people do not need help in doing things that are pleasant, so the people who come to you for motivation strategies may need help in doing things that are unpleasant or that they don't want to do, that will get them to the pleasant things that they do want to do. Typical motivation strategies, a visual construct of a task, for example, is accomplished, leading to a positive kinesthetic, or a VC of negative consequence of not doing a task, leading to a negative K. Motivation strategies are also related to procrastination strategies. They're the flip side of the same phenomenon. And you remember the intervention for procrastination we already talked about, which is a chain of anchors, which is written up on slide number 63. Now, the effects of an effective motivation strategy will be the voice, if present, in auditory, tonal, will have a good tonality. The voice will use modal operators of possibility instead of necessity. You remember that? That's words like can, it's possible, rather than should or have to or must. We'll use a representation of what is desirable about the task, the completion or consequences, rather than a representation of the process of doing the task. What's desirable about the completion. The task will be chunked appropriately, so that the person who's thinking about the task won't be thinking too detailed and then get overwhelmed, or won't be thinking too big pictured and then find out that they didn't get started on it at all. Toward strategies are way more enjoyable, and quite frankly, they result in less stress than away from strategies. So if possible, toward strategies usually work better. Toward, away, and mixed strategies work, and mixed is the most general that you'll find. If you're going to do a mixed strategy, as we did in chaining anchors, remember that you should do the away from first, or the negative first, and then the positive. I think if you have an away from strategy, you could try out replacing that away from with a toward strategy. And you could set the frame of, if you don't learn a new strategy, you'll have to feel bad all over and over and over again in the future, which uses their current strategy of moving away from, which then will assist them in moving toward. Critical elements in motivation strategy are association, dissociation. And remember that good strategies generally work across contexts, which means that the strategy will be useful in more than one context. Check the strategy and make sure it works in more than one context. I think you should always check ecology before you remove negative feelings or anxiety. And I think you should check the ecology to make sure that the client won't lose all their motivation. If the client does have their motivation change or disappear, you may want to go to values. And values are a master practitioner part of the master practitioner training. And I think they're also quite useful in determining and setting up motivation. Number 12, it may be necessary to adjust the submodalities of the representation of the task being done in order to get a strongly motivated response. And so you can adjust the submodalities. And remember, you can also adjust the values. Number 13, if representing the task as completed does not produce strong enough motivation, then focus on the consequences. Focus on the consequences. And number 14, remember that procrastinators are often good planners, but let's get them going. So we'll use procrastination to motivation. Here's an example of a good motivation strategy. Auditory digital in a pleasant voice. It will be so good when it's done, leading to visual construct of the completed task, of positive consequences, leading to a positive kinesthetic, leading to the beginning of the task, or future pacing appropriately. Here are some problems in motivation strategies. Let's look at page 60. The client could begin an overwhelm. If the client begins with a feeling of overwhelm, then that means they're probably chunked too high. Remember, a client who says I'm overwhelmed, and we talked about this in the hierarchy of ideas, the client who says I'm overwhelmed will probably be overwhelmed about what? Everything. That's right. The client say, what are you overwhelmed about? The client will say everything. And so you need to help the client in chunking down, and you may need to install a chunk down strategy in the process of motivation. Number two, some people move only away from, and sometimes if it's gotten better than what they moved away from, it may not be enough to motivate them. Or if they move away from regularly, they may have too much stress, too much anxiety, and too much unpleasantness. And so you may need to use timeline therapy to get rid of some of the anxiety and then change the values to increase the motivation again. Number three, using modal operators of necessity. A person may use modal operators of necessity with a harsh tonality, and that could result in bad feelings. For example, you should do this. And if a client motivates themselves by saying it in that tone of voice and with that kind of attitude, what's going to happen is that they're not going to be as motivated as they could, and certainly there'll be bad feelings. Oh, number four, by the way, there are some things that a person should move away from. I think that, for example, if there were a lion at your door, you better run like hell. If the wolf's going to come and eat you, you better be able to move and get out a gun or run and get the heck out of the way. It's really important to be careful about removing away from strategies entirely, and it's probably better to design a strategy with both elements. Okay, now let's talk about problems with decision-making strategies. Sometimes people have problems generating options in making a decision, and that might mean there's no visual construct, there's not enough options or choices. They might have an either-or choice. Oftentimes, clients limit themselves with an exclusive or. And that's where they say, I'll have to do this or that. I can't decide whether I should do this or that. And the answer, of course, is that they could do lots of other things other than just this or that. Sometimes clients limit themselves by only having one choice. In any case, you can also add in a number of choices by simply changing the decision-making strategy. Another possibility, of course, is that the person generates too many choices with no way to exit and no way to get out. And then these are the people who say, oh, I've got so many things I could do, but I can't possibly decide about what I want to do. So all of those can be cleaned up by simply changing the strategy. And you have to talk to the client and find out if you need to change the chunk size or whatever you need to change. Okay, number two, there may be a problem representing what the options are in the decision-making strategy. Options may not be represented in all representational systems, which make it difficult to evaluate them. The person may need to go external to get data to represent the options. And options and criteria may not be revised according to what's going on in their environment. So they may have outdated options or criteria. All of those can be cleared up by simply having the person go external. Number three, the problems may include evaluating the options. There may be criteria for selection which are inappropriate, or the criteria or values may not be prioritized. Generally, when a client has a criteria problem, number C, criteria are considered sequentially and separately rather than simultaneously, and a polarity response is an example. Generally, if a person has criteria problems, it may be necessary to go and fix those in working with values. And the problem is that we're now beginning to move into some master practitioner consideration. And so values are, of course, unfortunately or fortunately, a master practitioner are a part of the master practitioner training. Number D, the person may not get an overall evaluation of each criterion. So those are some possibilities that could result in problems with decision-making strategies. Let's look at page 61. Learning strategies. Now, you may, from time to time, have someone who comes to you with a problem in learning. It might be a client or a student, someone that wants to learn something. I, of course, work with a lot of kids, and we have some pretty good results with kids. We've had a lot of good results with kids. Kids are really simple to work with, and in spite of the fact we're giving you a lot of data and a lot of information, it's very, very simple to work with a child. In fact, why don't I, before the end of this program, just make sure that you have the intervention for working with kids, at least how I do it. Okay, so page 61, and these are some things I think you ought to think about when you're working with a kid. First of all, you want the learning strategy to begin in a positive state. If the student or you think of a time when you succeeded and felt good rather than failed and felt bad, you're going to have a better learning strategy. Learning is really inhibited by having negative emotions and negative states in the person's physiology at the time. So you want the client, you want the child to access, and then you want to anchor appropriate resources. Number two, you want to chunk appropriately. I think you want to chunk down the task that you're working on to avoid overwhelm. Chunking down means getting specific enough so that we're not overwhelmed about everything. Like, oh, I've got all this homework to do. Well, what specifically? And then chunk down and begin to get with working on each of the segments of the homework. And then recycle or go external till you can represent the smaller chunks so as to sequence and prioritize them. Number 3, you want to get relative appropriate feedback relative to the task being learned, which means the feedback that the student receives needs to be relative to the task that the student is learning. Number 4, you want to make appropriate comparisons that give one a feeling of accomplishment. Do not make any comparisons to experts or to an ideal person, but to your ability in the past. So always compare your own ideas of ability, your own ability, with the past, and not to an expert. But one of the problems, by the way, in many trainings or in many training situations is that the person who's teaching seems so expert and seems so far ahead of us that a lot of times we compare ourselves to that expert or to that ideal, and when we do, we come up short. So it's real important to not compare yourself to an expert, but compare yourself to your own ability in the past. Okay, number 5, the exit. There's a couple of things. You need to avoid the dangers of exiting too soon. When you exit too soon, when you're learning something, you get premature closure. And I don't know if you know, but I know a lot of people who've attained premature closure on a lot of different things. I once had a fellow who came up to me and he said, what do you do? And I said, oh, I'm an NLP master trainer. He says, oh, I know NLP. I've read Frogs into Princes. Well, me too. And there's nowhere near the totality of all the richness of NLP in one book. Obviously, that's someone who exited too soon and believed he'd learned everything he needed to learn. So exit when you've learned enough for now and when you've learned something well enough to get your outcome. I think you also should avoid the trap of chasing clarity, where you think, I need to know everything about it and be totally clear about it before I proceed. Remember that all important decisions are made on the basis of insufficient information. Number 6, I think you should expect not to understand some things. And I think those things that a student doesn't understand can be set aside and you can come back to them later. I think you should avoid getting trapped in bad feelings about not understanding. And remember, too, that understanding itself is a feeling. Number 7, you need to know your submodality equivalents of understanding and use them to get information in the necessary form. Now, we haven't discussed that yet, but think about this for a moment with regards to submodalities. Something you understand probably has a little bit separate or a little bit different set of submodalities than something that you're not clear about. For example, if you think about something that you totally understand, so if I said to you, do you understand this? And you'd go, yes, I totally understand it. Think about that and notice that that's quite a bit different from something which you don't understand. The submodalities of understanding could be useful, that if you take and place something you don't understand into the equivalence of understanding, assuming you have enough information, that you could then change your feeling about whether or not you understand them. That's useful for helping a student who seems to be stuck or who has a feeling of, oh, I'll never learn this, it's too complicated, it's too complex, there's too much to it. In which case, simply have them change the submodalities to submodalities of understanding. Number 8, I think you need to future-pace learning to the time and places when they'll be needed. So here are some elicitation questions for learning strategies, and I think probably, first of all, you ought to contextualize the learning, if you're working with a student, a child student, by subject matter. So I think you should contextualize it to spelling, or learning reading, or learning math, or arithmetic. Categorize it in that way and get real specific about the context, because sometimes people will use different strategies for understanding mathematics versus spelling versus reading, one of which they may love and the other of which they may not like. Okay, so the elicitation questions, think of a time when you were able to learn something easily and rapidly. How do you know it's time to begin learning? What do you do in order to learn? How do you know if you've learned something, and what lets you know you've learned something fully? So those are some things that I think are quite important. Let's look at page 62 for spelling strategies. And this is the rather long, involved discussion. When we get done with this, I'll talk to you a little bit about spelling strategy specifically that I use. But let me give you the full story here. In a spelling strategy, the steps, of course, are to discover, to utilize, to change and design, and to install. We'd find out what steps someone's using. We'd use the strategy to assist the student in learning. We'd automate a new sequence so it becomes part of the person's unconscious process. Changing also includes the process of designing and streamlining what's there to make it more effective. Or we could install a new strategy from scratch, and then installing, which would install a new strategy if necessary. So a spelling strategy elicitation, you want to start at the beginning, and you say, when I give you a word, what's the first thing you do on the inside? Then you can backtrack and go on. So first you blah, 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 then you do what, then you do what. Exactly the same as you heard me elicit with Lori. And then you make sure you get the steps that have to do with how to spell the word. Some bad spellers, by the way, do not have a really good spelling strategy. So you want to watch their eye patterns and notice what they do. And then you say, when you see, hear, or feel that, how do you know that it's right? And you get only as much detail as you need. So remember that, first of all, that bad spellers are made, they're not born, and bad spellers are not learning disabled, they were teacher disabled. So here are some inappropriate spelling strategies. Some begin with a negative kinesthetic. They begin with a bad feeling. Some people sound out the strategy phonetically. And by the way, you can't even read phonetics phonetically. Think about that for a moment if you know phonetics. Sound it out. That only gives you 50% accuracy. If you use visual construct, that's real creative spelling, but it really isn't the way to do it. The best way to do it, of course, is with visual recall. Now, an excellent spelling strategy will, if they're asked to spell the word, they may repeat the word internally, they see the word in visual remembered, or they may defocus rapidly. The way you can tell if a person is visualizing the word is you have to ask them to spell it backwards, and they'll be able to do that rapidly. Ask the child to spell the word backwards so you can tell whether or not they're visualizing it. That's going to be real important for you if you're working with a spelling strategy. Do they have a feeling of familiarity or not? And you want to look for a shift in breathing or gestures. And I think how good a speller they are may depend on what they read. Now, if a client doesn't get any feeling of familiarity, you could have them do a visual construct until they get the feeling of familiarity. And I think you need a secondary strategy for words for which no memory image exists, and then have the final kinesthetic be a motivator for continual improvement. Let's talk about how to install a spelling strategy next. Page 63. I think you want to ask the student, do you have any objections to being a good speller? Would it be okay for you to be a good speller? And then you want to put the new strategy only in the context of spelling. The new strategy, it will not result in instantly being an expert speller, but should result in rapid improvement. So this says here, check for reverse wiring. I think, and that has to do with eye patterns. You may want to write the word eye patterns on page 63. I think when you're working with a student, you want to check and make sure that they're normally organized. So ask them the questions about eye patterns on page 20. Use the eye pattern chart and ask them the questions about eye patterns on page 24 and see if they're normally organized or reversed organized. Can you think of a good friend and notice which way they're wired? The simplest method for installing a spelling strategy is rehearsal. And you can reframe if you need to. But you say, I'm going to give you a word, and as soon as I do, look up here, and then hold your hand in visual remembered. Allow an image of the word to appear, and as soon as it does, look down here and get a feeling of familiarity. Then you use simple words initially, and then you have them spell the words in reverse. Here are some common problems with spelling strategies. People try to create the word while looking in visual remembered. So you can say, look up here and wait until you see the word the way you have seen it before. Allow the image to pop up. If people draw a blank, if you have a person drawing a blank, one of the kids draws a blank, then write out the word and hold it up in their visual remembered so they can see it there. Have them look at it and then close their eyes and see it internally as a memory image. Hold up the word for a short period of time. If you hold it up too long, some people will try to describe it rather than see it in their memory. Number 4, have them visualize the word on something they can remember easily. And then number 5, a person may keep going back to their old strategy rather than using the new one. So reframe the persistent voice. If the first step is a negative kinesthetic, then create a resource anchor or use a dissociated state rehearsal if necessary. Okay, So that's spelling strategies. Let me talk for a moment about what my intervention with, what I do generally with kids when I'm working with them. And this is a complete intervention for both dyslexia, and also this is a complete intervention for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And this is what I'll typically do when I'm working with a child. For dyslexia, let's talk about dyslexia first. Typically, I'll say to the child, how do you spell success? And then I'll watch the kid and look and see if they go down into kinesthetic. Now, let me go big picture here for just a moment. Let me tell you a story about a 9-year-old boy that I worked with. And he had dyslexia. He'd been branded dyslexic. And he also had attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And they'd put him on Ritalin. And he was on Ritalin for a year before I saw him. When I saw him, he was he was actually sitting on the couch, and his mom was next to him, and he was slapping the couch with his hand, like this. Remember, I talked about that sort of thing in the rapport section. So I matched and married him using my foot. And I matched and married him using my foot, and when I got rapport with him, I slowed it down so he stopped slapping the couch, because that was sort of distracting to me. And one of the first things I said to him is, I said, what are you good at? And he said, I want to be skateboard champion. Now, here's the thing. Here's a kid who is really, really good. He has the potentiality. He's 9 years old, and he has the potentiality to be skateboard champion of the entire state. And so what does that mean? It probably means he's spelling using his kinesthetics. Now, if you were spelling using your kinesthetics, I wouldn't be surprised if you flipped letters or switched letters around or got letters mixed up, because spelling isn't done with the kinesthetics. Spelling is done with the visuals. So I figured, here's a boy who's using his kinesthetics to spell, and my guess is he probably was dyslexic, and he probably also got quite frustrated, and he probably also didn't know how to sit still in class. So the first thing I did was I taught him the visual spelling strategy. And the visual spelling strategy essentially went like this. All you do is take a piece of paper and you write the word, I like the word success, because when a child spells success, then they can go success. And so I wrote the word success on a piece of paper, and the first half of the word in blue and the second half of the word in red. S-U-C in blue, C-E-S-S in red. And then I said to the child, go ahead and spell. I held it up in his visual recall. He was normally organized, and I checked that out by asking him the questions on page 24 and determined that his eye patterns were normally organized. I think it's real important to determine that first, because you may get a child, if they're not kinesthetic, you may get a child who has some brain dominance issues, and they may not have chosen a dominant hemisphere yet, or they may be ambidextrous, and so they may not have a consistent place where they can look for words. So a child, I think you ought to, first of all, check their eye patterns. Then I held the word success up in his visual recall, and he spelled it forward several times. So I said, spell the blue, S-U-C, spell the red, C-E-S-S, spell the blue, S-U-C, spell the red, C-E-S-S. And he did that several times until he had, I thought it was sort of drilled in. And then I said, close your eyes and spell the blue. He said, S-U-C, spell the red, C-E-S-S. Now, with your eyes closed, spell the red. And he said, C-E-S-S, and spell the blue, S-U-C. Then I asked him to spell it backwards. And he spelled it backwards perfectly, which surprised him and surprised his mom, who was still sitting there. His mom was like, in England they say, gobsmacked. Her mouth was open and she's going, whoa. Now here's her son, who she knows is intelligent, but he's spelling success backwards in a matter of minutes. Now that's a real positive experience for both the kid and for her. And I said to him, you've got a perfect visual memory, and I've got bad news for you. You've either got to use it or lose it. And so I want you to use it. And the way you spell words is by putting them up in visual recall and looking at them, and then keeping them there, and then remembering them. And then when you go to take the test, also look up into visual recall, and make sure that you know that. Now, and make sure you can actually see the word there, and make sure that you know that. And so he did, And we tried several different words, and he got very, very good in less than a half an hour at spelling words forwards and backwards. Now, what was important about this boy? He wanted to be skateboard champion, and I think every child who comes and sees you has a tremendous amount of potentiality, especially if they're learning disabled. And most kids, by the way, who are attention deficit disorder or who are dyslexic are usually above average intelligence. The problem is they're moving quicker and they're spelling things in different ways from the way the teachers think they should. So the first thing we taught the boy was the visual spelling strategy. He got very good at it. And so he became excited about learning other things. And so the next thing I said to him was, how would you like to learn a technique that will make time go faster? You'll be able to spend more time skateboarding, because that's what he liked to do. Be more time practicing your skateboarding, and you'll be able to be a champ. You'll get better tests on quizzes. You'll have to study less, and mom will get off your back, and the teacher will get off your back, and you'll do better in school. Well, he says, yeah, I'd like to learn that. And I said, because we don't have to. We don't have to learn it today, but would you like to? And he says, yes. And I think one of the things that when you begin to work with a child, each time you work with a child, you want to make sure the kid wants to be there. Because if they don't, I'll tell you what, they will punish you. And so I always ask the kid, what are you doing here? And I ask them for themselves, do you want to be here? For yourself. And you need to make sure that they want to be there for themselves. Making sure they want to be there for themselves, then you certainly, and I think you ought to tell them what you can do. So I said to him, I want to teach you a technique, and we'll show you how to have time go faster. You'll study less, you'll get better grades, and you get out of the special school, and you'll be back in public school, which is where he wanted to go. And you'll be back with all your friends. Would you like that? And he goes, yes, I'd love it. So then I said, and you may want to try this. If you're not driving a car, why don't you do this with me just real quickly? Because this is what we call the learning state. This is the learning state. This is the learning state, and it's very, very simple to learn, and it makes learning very, very easy to do. So let's do the learning state. What I said to the boy was, can you pick a spot on the wall? And as you pick a spot on the wall, say up there. And I have him pick a spot on the wall above eye level. Generally above the midline, maybe even on the ceiling, so his sort of eyes have to bump up, his field of vision bumps up against his eyebrows. And I said, go ahead and pick that spot on the wall to look at. And as you look at that spot on the wall, notice within a matter of moments that you can see things in your peripheral vision. If you look at that spot on the wall and you totally focus in on it, take every scrap of your attention and totally focus in on that spot on the wall. As you do that, notice that you can actually see things in your peripheral vision. Now, if you're doing this at home, or if you're doing this while you're listening, notice that within a matter of moments, having focused totally on the spot on the wall, that you can begin to see things in your periphery. In fact, you may want to just test and see how far into the peripheral you can see. Some people can very quickly see all the way around 180 degrees. You can look and notice, if you're just holding your eyes steady on that thing on the spot on the wall, notice if you can see all the way around to your right. Take your hand, if you want to, and move your hand around to the right and see how far you can see your hand. Usually it'll be about 180 degrees. Then take your other hand and go around to the left and see how far that you can see there. And you'll notice that it's probably out into 180 degrees. Now notice still keeping your attention on that spot on the wall. Now notice as you sit there with your attention in the peripheral that you can then bring your eyes down and look at something in your field of vision directly in front of you, but still keeping all of your awareness in the peripheral. And you can calibrate the child. If you actually look at the child, you can actually see the child when they're in this state. We worked with a 12-year-old girl just last week who had attention deficit disorder, and we showed her how to do this, and within a matter of moments, it just calmed her right down. Totally calmed her down. And so you'll see the child calm right down. You'll see them shift from sympathetic to parasympathetic functioning, if you're aware of that. And this is the state we want the child in during the class. And so what we tell the child is, look, when you go into classroom, go into this state. It'll make time go fast. Everything will be more fun. It's easier to learn in. It's a lot of fun. It's a great state to be in. So just go into class and be in this state. So the child goes to class, and what I say is it's kind of like putting a trap door in your brain. And then I put my hand on top of my head as if my hand was a trap door. And I say, so when you walk into class, you open up the trap door to your brain by going into the learning state like this. And the door opens up. And then teacher pours all the information into your brain. Glug, 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 glug. And then at the end of the day, or at the end of the class, you close the trapdoor to your brain and you go on to the next class. I said, then when you go to take the test, open up that trapdoor to your brain and pour all the information from your brain out onto the paper by going back into the learning state. If you teach a child how to use the learning state for being in class, for remembering information, and for recalling information and regurgitating it then for tests, what will happen is two things will happen. Is their grade point average will go up dramatically. I have, every single child I've worked with, I've gotten a 1 to a 1.5 grade point increase simply by doing the learning state. And here's what happens. The child usually has an increase in test scores and quiz scores because their memory and their recall goes up so dramatically. Remember that, and I think here this is an important point if you're going to be doing this work with kids. Remember that every single event, every single thing that's ever happened to you in your life is faithfully recorded by your unconscious mind. Remember that in 1957, a guy named Penfield drilled a hole in a woman's brain, and he was trying to cure her epilepsy. And she remembered everything from a birthday party when she was age 2. He actually took a drill and went zip right into her brain, and then he started probing around in her brain with an electrode. And as he probed her brain with an electrode, he found that she remembered various things from parties when she was like 2. And she remembered a birthday party when she was 2. She could feel the crinoline in her dress. She could remember the feeling of it. She could see her parents as they looked when she was 2. She could see her friends when they were 2. She could remember the smell of the birthday cake. She could remember the taste of the birthday cake, everything. And this was a memory she hadn't thought about since she was age 2. So Penfield proved in 1957 that everything that happens to us is recorded faithfully in our brain. Well, so that solves all the problems about whether or not a child can remember something or not. Everything that happens is recorded. Everything that happens, you remember, or the child remembers. That's not the issue. The issue is not, to be honest with you, the issue is not whether or not they remember it, because everyone does. The issue is, can they get in touch with it? Can they recall it and bring it out at the classroom time when it comes to take the test? And of course, so the learning state is the state that allows them to do that. The learning state's real powerful. Ernest Rossi, in the Psychobiology of Mind-Body Healing, says that all memory is dependent upon the state in which it occurs. And so what we essentially do is we give the child a really solid state, a really good state for them to be able to take information in and store it, and then to be able to give it back. And that's the learning state. So again, it's very, very simple. You simply have the child pick a spot on the wall to look at, focus in on that spot on the wall. As they focus on that spot of the wall, they allow their awareness to extend out into the peripheral. And then when their awareness is fully in the peripheral, they bring their eyes down and they focus on the teacher in the class. That's going to have them be, now just between us, they're going to be in a light trance for that. Now, we're not going to tell their parents or them that they're going to be in a trance. We like to use the word learning state. That's probably a little more, shall we say, socially acceptable. I mean, my child's going to be in hypnosis in class? Oh, my God. Well, I mean, never mind that teachers hypnotize people regularly. They just aren't trained in it. And so I'd rather we were trained in it, because then we could be sure what we're doing. So we train the child on how to do it himself or herself, that they go into trance, and then they can easily, very, very easily be able to recall the information. They can sort it out, and then they can be able to regurgitate it on their test very easily. And that's the learning state. So both the learning state and the visual spelling strategy are really, really useful for working with kids and making sure that the kids, we can increase their grade points, increase their grade point average, and increase their recall to where we'll actually see, in my experience, we'll actually see about a 1 to a 1.5 grade point increase. I've had some kids go from almost up to 2 grade points simply using the spelling strategy and the visual spelling strategy and the learning state. And I've had some kids go up and get almost a 2-point grade point increase. Of course, adults can use the learning state, and adults can use the visual spelling strategy if they want to. And all of those, of course, are very, very useful for increasing their recall and their ability to learn. So that's our tour de force of strategies. We've gone through strategies pretty well. I think we're pretty clear about how to install, how to change, and how to make the kind of changes that you want to make. We'll learn a couple of more techniques for students when you come to the practitioner training, and we'll also learn a little bit more about installing strategies. But for now, I think that's enough. Thanks for joining us for program number 11. We're going to move on to reframing next, and that's in program number 12.